Modern India, Chapter 4, Part 3. The Rule of Law. The British introduced the modern concept of rule of law. This meant that their administration was to be carried out, at least in theory, in obedience to laws which clearly defined the rights, privileges, and obligations of the subjects, and not according to the caprice or personal discretion of the ruler. In practice, of course, the bureaucracy and the police enjoyed arbitrary powers and interfered with the rights and liberties of the people. The rule of law was to some extent a guarantee of the personal liberty of a person. It is true that previous rulers in India had been in general bound by tradition and custom, but they always had a legal right to take away any administrative steps they wanted, and there existed no other authority before whom their acts could be questioned. The Indian rulers and chiefs sometimes exercised this power to do as they wanted. Under British rule, on the other hand, administration was largely carried on according to laws as interpreted by the courts through the laws themselves were often defective according to the laws as interpreted by the courts, though the laws themselves were often defective, were made not by the people through a democratic process but autocratically by the foreign rulers, and left a great deal of power in the hands of civil servants and the police. But that was perhaps inevitable in a foreign regime that could not, in the very nature of things, be democratic or libertarian. Equality before the law. The Indian legal system under the British was based on the concept of equality before law. This meant that the eyes of laws of all men were equal. That in the eyes of laws all men were equal. The same law applied to all persons irrespective of their caste, religion, or class. Previously, the judicial system had paid heed to caste distinctions and had differentiated between the so-called high-born and low-born. For the same crime, lighter punishment was awarded to the Brahmin than to the non-Brahmin. Similarly, in practice, zamindars and nobles were not judged as harshly as the commoner. In fact, very often they could not be brought to justice at all for their actions. Now, the humble could also move the machinery of justice. There was, however, one exception to this excellent principle of equality before the law. The Europeans and their descendants had separate courts and even laws. In criminal cases, they could be tried only by European judges. Many English officials, military officers, planters, and merchants behaved with Indians in a haughty, harsh, and even brutal manner. When efforts were made to bring them to justice, they were given indirect and undue protection and consequently light or no punishment, and by many of the European judges before whom alone they could be tried. Consequently, miscarriage of justice occurred frequently. In practice, there emerged another type of legal inequality. Justice became quite expensive as the court fees had to be paid, lawyers engaged, and expenses of witnesses met. Courts were often situated in distant towns. Lawsuits dragged on for years. The complicated laws were beyond the grasp of the illiterate and ignorant peasants. Invariably, the rich could turn and twist the laws and courts to operate in their own favor. The mere threat to take poor person through the long process of justice from the lower court to the highest court of appeal and thus to face him with complete ruin often sufficed to bring him to heel. Moreover, the widespread prevalence of corruption in the ranks of the police and the rest of the administrative machinery led to the denial of justice. Officials often favored the rich. The zamindars oppressed the ryots without fear of official action. In contrast, the system of justice had prevailed in pre-British times was comparatively informal, speedy, and inexpensive. Thus, while the new judicial system marked a great step forward in so far it was based on the laudable principles of the rule of law and equality before law and on rational and human-made laws. It was a retrograde step in some other respects. It was now costlier and involved long delays. Social and cultural policy. We have seen that the British authorities recognized and regulated India's economy in the interest of the British trade and industry and organized a modern administrative system to guarantee order and security. Till 1813, they also followed the policy of non-interference in the religious, social, and cultural life of the country. But after 1813, they took active steps to transform Indian society and culture. This allowed the rise of new interests and new ideas in Britain during the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the middle of the 18th century, and the consequent growth of the industrial capitalism were fast changing all aspects of British society. The rising industrial interest wanted to make India a big market for their goods. This could not be accomplished merely by adhering to the policy of keeping peace and required partial transformation and modernization of Indian society. And so, in words of historical Thomson and Garrett, the mood and the methods of the old brigandage were changing into those of modern industrialism and capitalism. Old brigandage were changing to those of modern industrialism and capitalism. Science and technology also opened new vistas for human progress. In 18th and 19th centuries witnessed a great ferment of new ideas in Britain and Europe which influenced the British outlook towards the Indian problems. All over Europe new attitudes of minds, manners and morals were appearing. The great French Revolution of 1789 with the message of liberty, equality and fraternity generated powerful democratic sentiments and unleashed the force of modern nationalism. In the realm of thought, the new trend was represented by Bacon, Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau, Kant, Adam Smith, and Bentham. In the realm of literature, by Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, and Charles Dickens. The impact of the new thought, the product of the intellectual revolution of the 18th century in the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, was naturally felt in India and some extent affected to official notions of the government. The three outstanding characteristics of the new thought were rationalism or faith in reason and science, humanism or love of man, and confidence in the capacity of man to progress. The rational and scientific attitudes indicated that only the true which was in conformity with the human reason and capable of being tested in practice. The scientific progress of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and the tremendous powers of production released by the application of science to industry were visible proofs of the power of human reason. Humanism was based on the belief that every human being was an end in himself and should not be respected and prized as such. No man had the right to look upon another human being as a mere agent of his own happiness. The humanistic outlook gave birth to the doctrines of individualism, liberalism, and socialism. According to the doctrine of progress, all societies must change with time. Nothing was or could be static. Moreover, man had the capacity to remodel nature and society on rational and just lines. The new currents of thought in Europe came into conflict with the old outlook and produced a clash of attitudes among those who determined Indian policy or ran the Indian administration. The older attitude, known as the conservative or traditional attitude, was that of making a few changes in India as possible. The early representative of these attitudes were Warren Hastings and Edmund Burke, the famous writer and parliamentarian, and later ones the famous officials Monroe, Malcolm, Elphinstone, and Metcalfe. The conservatives maintained the Indian civilization was different from European civilization, but it was not necessarily inferior to it. Many of them respected and admired the Indian philosophy and culture, realizing that it might be necessary to introduce some Western ideas and practices. They proposed to introduce them very cautiously and gradually, favoring social stability overall. They opposed program of rapid change, sweeping or hasty innovations they felt would produce violent reaction in the country. The conservative outlook remained influential in England as well as in India up to the very end of the British rule. In fact, the majority of the British officials in India were generally of the conservative persuasion. By 1800s, the conservative attitude was fast giving way to a new attitude which was sharply critical of Indian society and culture. Indian civilization was condemned as static, it looked down upon with contempt, and Indian customs were considered uncivilized. Indian institutions corrupt and undecent and decadent, and Indian thought narrow and unscientific. This critical approach was now most of the officials and writers and statements of Britain to justify political and economic enslavement. In of India and to proclaim that it was an incapable of improvement and must therefore remain permanently under the British tutelage. However, a few Englishmen known as radicals went beyond this narrow criticism and imperialistic outlook and applied the advanced humanistic and rational thought of the West to the Indian situation as they saw it. The doctrine of reason led them to believe that India need not always be a fallen country, for all societies had the capacity to improve by following the dictates of reason and science. The doctrine of humanism led them to desire the improvement of Indian people. The doctrine of progress, the doctrine of progress led them to the conviction that Indians were bound to improve. And so the radicals, through few but representing the better elements of British society, desired to make India part of a modern progressive world of science and humanism. To them, the answer of India's ill appeared to lie in the introduction of modern Western sciences, philosophy, and literature. In fact, in all out and rapid change along the modern lines. Some of the officials who came to India in 1820s and afterward deeply influenced by the radical outlook. It must, however, be emphasized at this stage that such an honest and philanthropic Englishmen were few and that their influence was never decisive so far as the British administration of India was concerned. The ruling elements in the British East India administration continued to be imperialistic and exploitative. They would accept new ideas and adopt reformist measures only if, to the extent that they did not come into conflict with the commercial interest and the profit motives, and enabled economic penetration of India and the consolidation of British rule. Modernization of India had to occur within the broad limits imposed by the needs of easier and more thorough exploitation of its resources. Thus, modernization of India was accepted by many English officials, businessmen, and statesmen because it was expected to make Indians better customers for British goods and reconcile them to the Indian rule. In fact, many of the radicals themselves no longer remained true to their own beliefs when they discussed Indian policy. Instead of working for a democratic government as they did in Britain, they demanded a more authoritarian regime, described by them as paternalistic. In this respect, they were at one with the conservative, who too were ardent champions of paternalism and would treat the Indian people as children and keep them out of administration. The basic dilemma before the British administrators in India was that while the British interest in India could not be served without some modernization, full modernization would generate forces which would go against their interest and would, in the long run, endanger the British supremacy in the country. They had therefore to follow a delicately balanced policy of partial modernization, that is, the policy of introducing modernization in some respects and blocking and preventing it in the other aspects. In other words, modernization in India was to be colonial modernization carried out within the parameters of and with the view of to promote colonialism. The policy of modeling India, society, and culture was also encouraged by the Christian missionaries and religious minded persons such as Wilberforce and Charles Grant. The chairman of the court of directors was of the East India Company, who wanted to spread Christianity in India. They too adopted the critical attitude towards Indian society but on a religious grounds. They passionately believed that Christianity alone was the true religion and that all other religions were false. They supported program of westernization of the hope that it would eventually lead to the country's conversion to Christianity. They thought that the light of Western knowledge would destroy the people's faith in their own religions and lead them to welcome and embrace Christianity. They therefore opened modern schools, colleges, and hospitals in the country. The missionaries were, however, often most unwilling allies of the rationalist radicals, whose scientific approach undermined the only Hindu and Muslim mythology but Christian mythology as well. As Professor H.H. Dodwell has pointed out, taught to question the validity of their own gods, they, the Westernites Indians, questioned also the validity of the Bible and the truth of its narrative. The missionaries also supported the paternalistic imperialistic policy, since they looked upon the law and order of British supremacy as an essential for their work of religious propaganda. They also sought to support the British merchants and manufacturers by holding out the hope that Christian converts would be better customers for the goods. The radicals were given strong support by Raja Ram Mohan Roy and other like minded Indians who were conscious of the low state to which the country and society had sunk, who were sick of caste prejudices and other social evils, and who believed that the salvation of India lay in the science and humanism. We will discuss the outlook of activities of this Indian at length in the next chapter. Other reasons Other reasons why the government of India followed a policy cautious and gradual innovation and not of all out modernization was continuous prevalence of the conservative outlook among among the British officials in India and the belief that interference in the religious beliefs and social customs might produce a revolutionary reaction among the Indian people. Even the most ardent radicals paid heed to the warning for, along with the other members of the British government classes. They too desired most of all the safety and perpetuation of British rule in India. Every other consideration was secondary importance. As a matter of fact, the policy of hesitant and weak modernization was gradually abandoned after 1858 as Indians proved apt pupils shifted rapidly towards modernization of their society and assertion of their culture and demanded to be ruled in accordance with the modern principles of liberty, equality, and nationality. The British increasingly withdrew their support from the reformers and gradually came to the side with the socially orthodox and conservative elements of society. They also encouraged casteism and communalism.